All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. It is for me, at least. We're going to go ahead and talk about behavioral ecology today. It's possible that this is going to be a pretty long presentation. I'm going to time it over here. So if it gets too long, I'll split it into two different presentations. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what ethology is. Ethology is the science of studying animal behavior, and it's a super cool area, an area that I'm super interested in. And scientists, when they're doing ethology studies, they use something that's called an ethogram. And an ethogram is basically, this is what this person is doing in the picture here, is a list of behaviors. And then every minute or 5 minutes, it depends on the interval, they mark down whether or not they're observing that particular behavior. And so it's supposed to be super objective and a way of not trying to interpret the behaviors, just identifying what behaviors they're seeing. The interpretation can be done later, but that's called an ethogram. And that's what we do in the pillbug lab. And then in the pillbug lab, we're trying to determine whether in the choice chambers, whether the pillbugs are having or showing taxis movement or kinesis movement. So is their movement purposeful? So are they moving toward the bananas and away from the Cheerios? I don't know what you put in your choice chambers. Or is it kinesis movement, meaning they're just moving around and they're sampling everything, and it's not specific to whether you put banana or Cheerio in your particular choice chamber. And so we're going to use a chi-square analysis to determine that. All right, and then this is what it looks like. So you design your experiment with two choice chambers. You're going to measure their movement, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at a chi-square. And this is what an ethogram would look like, where you're going to just mark how many are in the left chamber and in the right chamber. A real ethogram might have behaviors listed and how many times you're spotting certain types of behaviors. All right, so let's move on from that. So we're going to really get into depth talking about behaviors. So there's two different types of explanations for behavior. There's the proximate explanation for behavior and the ultimate explanation. Proximate relates to physiologically how that behavior is occurring, what hormones are going on, what nerve impulses are happening. We're going to be talking more tonight about the ultimate explanations of behavior, which is just why the behaviors are occurring. Why is a cheetah peeing on a tree? Like, what's the significance of that? And that would be the ultimate explanation for their behavior. All right, so before we jump into animal behavior, the College Board used to have an entire unit on plants, and now they've kind of squeezed plants into the behavior unit, into the ecology unit, by implying that plants have behaviors. Well, they do. They have physiological responses. It's not the kind of behaviors that you and I think of with animals or with our pill bugs, but plants have special kinds of behaviors that are kind of surprising, or physiological responses. We're going to just talk about a few of them. There are many, 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 many more than I'm going to mention today. So the first one, which I have always found fascinating, is called phototropism. So photo means light, and trope refers to the movement toward. So shoots, the top part of the plant, they exhibit positive phototropism. And in this case, positive means towards. So they grow towards the light. But the roots, they grow away from light. And so they experience what's called negative phototropism. So how do they do it? It's pretty cool. I like this. I think this diagram is pretty neat. It says, I'll just read it to you. Proteins called phototropins detect light. What? That's cool. They don't have eyeballs. How do they know where the light is? On the shady side of the stem that we're looking at, on the shady side, a hormone called auxin is released that triggers elongation of cells on the shady side. So the cells on the shady side start getting longer, and that causes the stem to bend toward the light, because these guys are getting longer and they bend toward the light. I think that's pretty cool. Phototropins are located at the tip of the shoot. So they've learned with experiments, and you can do this in the lab too. I did this when I was in college. If you put a cap on the top of the a cap on the top of the shoot, then it doesn't experience phototropism. It doesn't grow because the phototropins, the proteins, don't recognize the light, and so no auxin is released, and then the cells grow evenly instead of unevenly. All right, so that's just one example. Other examples, gravitropism, also called geotropism, is growth towards or away from gravity. Can you figure out which one is the positive and which one is the negative? Hmm. It's a super cool concept because how they even know where gravity is located. Think about a seed. A seed is going to land in a random position in the soil. How does it know to grow up, the shoot to grow up? How come the shoot doesn't grow sideways or down? And how do the roots know to grow down? Well, they're experiencing gravitropism. So, and it moves in the opposite direction from phototropism. So shoots grow away from gravity. We call that negative gravitropism, as opposed to the shoots were showing positive phototropism. They show negative gravitropism. And then the roots grow toward gravity, which is called positive gravitropism. All right, and then there's photoperiodism. Photoperiodism refers to the regulation of flowering or other developmental processes in response to the length of the day. We call that the photoperiod. It allows coordination of flowering with seasons, and I'll get my picture out of the way. There we go. It's a good place to put me. And what's super interesting about these, if you take a look in the short day plants, take a look at the first diagram. So you see that there's a short amount of night and a lot of day. And it says flowers when uninterrupted darkness exceeds critical night length. So when they have a long amount of night, that's when they flower. Long day plants are just the opposite. When they have a short amount of night and a long amount of daylight, that's when they flower. But what's super interesting is how a burst of light can screw them up. So take a look what happens in the short day plants. A burst of light in the middle of the night, say from a car headlight, say from a street lamp, say from a flashlight. It's got to be a certain length. So not just a burst, not like lightning. That's not enough to screw them up. But a amount of time where there's light, that'll keep them from flowering. So super interesting. That's called photoperiodism. So the mechanism of photoperiodism is still a bit of a mystery to science. All right, next it says plants also defend against herbivory. Many plants have bark, waxy cuticles, thorns, or spines. Those are all intended to protect them from herbivores. If the herbivore breaches the first defenses, the plant can actually respond with toxic compounds that make the animal sick or itchy, all kinds of things. Plants may even produce antimicrobial compounds if they're being attacked by parasites or bacteria, and airborne compounds that attract pest predators. So they're called VOCs, volatile olfactory compounds. I think that's what it stands for. Plants can release them into the air if they're being nibbled on by pests, and that scent, that olfactory, attracts the predators of the pests. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Who knew? So the picture, I'll get my picture out of the way here, is of acacia. It says the large thorns of acacia are actually hollow and offer shelter for the ants, which the ants then in return protect the plant against herbivores. Pretty cool. All right, and then it says, this is the last one we're going to talk about. Plants even attract pollinators. The color in their flowers is specific to the organism that pollinates them. So for example, bees are able to see ultraviolet colors that we cannot see. So these two sets of photos on top, those show you what bees see. So this is what the human eye sees. We can't see ultraviolet color. This is what the bee sees. And they refer to this pattern, this circle here, as a target that shows the bee exactly where they need to go in order to find nectar or pollen or what have you. Same thing on this yellow flower. The dandelion on the right is the way we would see it. This is how the bee sees the dandelion. It's got that perfect little target for them. Think that's super cool. Hummingbirds, on the other hand, are attracted to red colors. So oftentimes hummingbird pollinated flowers are bright red, as you can see in the image. The flower shape is also important for attracting different pollinators. So for example, hummingbirds have the trumpet-shaped flowers, so forth and so on. And then of course, nectar attracts pollinators. So even though we don't think of plants as having behaviors, they are pretty complex things. And there's so much more we didn't get to talk about. All right, now let's get into actual animal behavior. Behavior requires communication, and we're going to talk about chemical versus symbolic signals. So, the first chemical signals, and my picture's in the way there, minnows before alarm and minnows after alarm. Substances in the environment or pheromones, and we're going to talk about what pheromones are, produced by other organisms, can serve as chemical signals. So, take a look at the diagram. You've got these happy little minnows, and then the scientist drops in an alarm signal, a chemical signal, and all the minnows swim away as fast as they can to the bottom corner of the tank. So that's an example of a chemical signal. So it says down at the bottom, minnows responding to an alarm chemical on the skin of a predatory fish. It's obviously been injected by a scientist in this case. All right, another example of chemical signals, or a continuation actually on this, is the idea of the pheromones. What are pheromones? So pheromones are a secreted chemical factor that triggers a social response in members of the same species. So it could trigger alarm, like we saw in the minnows. It could trigger a food trail where others start to follow the food trail. I'll explain that. That's what the diagram is. There are even sex pheromones that attract members of the opposite sex. So let's take a look at what the ants are laying down with their pheromones. So number one, it says the scout finds food and lays a pheromone trail. Ants follow the trail to the food source. So they smell this pheromone and then they move toward that source. Ants who cannot access the food return without laying down another trail. So the trail starts to weaken over time. When the food is gone, no new trails are set. The original trail decays and they stop going toward that food. Oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? I think that's super cool. I do have a video. I don't have time to show these videos, so you would definitely want to click on these videos, and I'll try to mention all the videos that we have that are embedded in this set of notes, but this one is about ants following the pheromones. Oh, murder hornets, so freaky. Some lepidopterans, which are moths and butterflies, can detect mates from as far away as 10 kilometers or more than 6 miles away. That's an example of chemical signals and pheromones. Scientists, smarties, are using sex hormones to lure in murder hornets. So they're trying to capture murder hornets. And if you don't know what a murder hornet is, then you need to click on that link, that YouTube link, and it'll show you, oh my gosh, the scariest animals I've ever seen. All right, continuing with chemical signals. My picture's in the way where it says chemical signals. Some animals defend territories through olfactory, through scent marking. So that's what the cheetahs are doing. They're peeing on the tree there. Visual, so look at the tree and it has claw marks on it. That's actually from a bear. Or auditory means, so in that case, the red-winged blackbird is staking out his territory. And it is a he because you can tell by the red patches on his shoulders. He's staking out his territory by using sound, auditory means. So it says here, defending territories increases reproductive success. So remember, this all has to tie into natural selection and evolution. These animals have to be more successful for these traits to pass on. And if this works, then they're going to pass on their traits and their offspring are going to be doing the same things. So it allows these animals to protect their food sources and their nesting sites, their mating areas, and or it can even attract mates. And I'll explain that in a second. And it limits actual physical altercations. So let me just give I can give lots of examples, but if you look at the cheetahs, they're marking out their territory. Other cheetahs that come in identify that territory, and as long as another cheetah doesn't cross the line, there's no physical altercation. They just respect each other's boundaries. They pee and they have these little territories set up. And as long as nobody crosses over, it's only when somebody decides to cross over that there's actually a physical altercation. So it keeps them healthier by having these ways of identifying whose territory is whose. With the red-winged blackbird, there's so much to say and I won't say it all, but with the red-winged blackbird, once they fly into a new territory in the spring, they'll choose a territory and they'll sort of advertise it. I won't say sing because it is an ugly sound that red-winged blackbirds make. But they'll advertise their territory, and then the females who don't have the red patches, they're brown, they're more well camouflaged, will come and inspect the territories of the different males. They tend to hang out in cattails in wetlands. And so the females will go and inspect the territories. And when they find a male that they feel has a good territory, then they'll mate with that male and they'll nest in that territory. So just super interesting how animals can do that. All right, and then this was kind of my joke. This Far Side cartoon, if you guys are familiar with Far Side, down at the bottom it says, "And now, Randy, by use of song, the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals." I think about this with gang tags also, when we're constantly spray painting all over our communities saying, "This is my territory." Yeah, we're so different from those animals, aren't we? All right, now we're going to talk, instead of talking about the chemical signals, we're going to talk about what are called symbolic signals. So this is not using olfactory. This involves the use of calls or gestures. For example, the honeybee waggle dances. And again, this is linked to a video you definitely should watch. But basically, this is how honeybees identify where food is, like how they communicate where food is to the other members of their hive. And it's absolutely fascinating. They do dances, and the direction that they dance and the turns that they make and how many times they wiggle their butts, that sends the message to this captive audience that you see that's around them, and it tells them whether they need to fly straight out or turn left and how far they need to go in order to find that source of pollen. Another example are calls or wolf howls, of course. Bird mating dances are another example of symbolic signals. Definitely take a look at that video because they're fascinating. Symbolic communication has increased in complexity and diversity over evolutionary time. The more and more successful these symbols are, the more complex they've been able to be, as long as they're increasing the fitness of the organisms that are doing them and that the other organisms around them understand these signals, it gets more and more complex. All right, and then of course, gestures can be used to signal dominance. These two elephant seals duke it out with posturing, the way that they gesture. And of course, gorillas and the pounding on the chest are ways of signaling dominance. All right, and now let's talk. I'm trying to see how much time has gone by. I think I'm going to go ahead. Yep, I'm about 17 minutes in. Let's talk about innate versus learned behaviors. So the cool photo on the left, two chimps are fishing for termites using a blade of grass. And that's something that they teach each other. So they watch and then they learn how to fish out termites. They stick this blade of grass in and they pull it out and the termites are attached, and then they lick off the grass and they eat these termites. Brilliant. All right, so natural selection, like we said, favors innate and learned behaviors. We're going to clarify what those two terms mean, that increase survival and reproductive success, or fitness. So as long as these behaviors are successful for the parents, they're going to pass it on to their offspring. All right, so the first one that we're going to talk about, I'm trying to get my picture out of the way. These are the innate behaviors. So innate means it's entirely under genetic control. It's not something that they've learned, they just know how to do it. Humans have some innate behaviors, they have many more learned behaviors. And sometimes these are called fixed action patterns. A fixed action pattern is a highly stereotypical behavior that's triggered by a assigned stimulus. Stereotypical. Let's see. What do we mean by that? It's not stereotypes like we think of. Stereotypical means I could just describe it, and every one of the members of that species, if you have the proper signal, they're going to do exactly that behavior. That's what we're talking about by highly stereotypical. So for example, with these stickleback fish, they have an aggression response toward anything, that's the weird part, anything that has a red underside. Well, usually in their environment, the thing that has a red underside is another male stickleback. And so they have this major aggressive response to another male stickleback. Only it's so genetic, they're not thinking about it at all. So anything that has a red underbelly, they're going to attack. And so scientists have found that if you just show them any kind of object that has a red underbelly, they're going to attack it. Likewise, if you show them a male stickleback, this one here, this image here, if you show them that, they're not going to attack it because it doesn't have a red underbelly. And in fact, there's a story in one of the textbooks that the researchers were doing this, and a red pickup truck drove by the window where they were doing this research, and the stickleback attacked toward the red pickup truck that drove by. So that's an example of an innate behavior and a fixed action pattern. And there are many others that are fascinating. So we see them a lot in birds. So this is just an example here. So herring gulls, that's what these are. Their chicks tap at the red spot. Do you see the red spot on the gull's beak there? This triggers parental regurgitation. So remember that the parents eat and then they puke, into their babies' mouths, and that's how the babies feed because the babies can't, they're helpless. So it triggers parental regurgitation and a meal for the chick. If the parent is replaced with a stick, so there's no parent there, and you just put a stick with a red dot, the chicks are going to peck at the red dot. They're genetically programmed to peck at a red dot. They don't care about a parent. If they see red, peck, 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 and they're hoping for a meal. So that's an example of a fixed action pattern. And another one that is a little bit more complex, absolutely fascinating. And there's so many more. These are just a few examples. Greylag geese mothers will use her bill to push eggs back. So if eggs roll out of the nest, which they do quite frequently, if an egg rolls out of the nest, she will use her bill to push the egg back in, but in a very stereotypical way. In fact, the females will show the same behaviors if the egg is removed. They'll push at an imaginary egg, or if the egg is replaced with, say, a volleyball. If we put a volleyball instead of an egg there, the mother is going to push at it with her beak until she gets it back into the nest. And that's an example of a fixed action pattern. It's genetic. She's not thinking about it. Egg rolls away, push it back. Egg rolls away, push it back. Volleyball rolls away, push it back. Imaginary thing rolls away, push it back. All right, and now we're going to talk about what a lot of people are actually more interested in, which are the learned behaviors. So learned behaviors require experience. They're not entirely under genetic control, and there are 5 types of learned behaviors. Imprinting is a fascinating crossover between the genetics and the learned part. Imprinting, and you see this especially in birds, but it's in other organisms as well. It says young animals learn to identify a parent during a critical period. For the birds, it's usually 12 to 24 hours after birth. So basically, especially, and you can see an awesome example with the dog and the chicks here. When the chicks hatch, if the dog is present in that critical period between 12 and 24 hours, they're going to identify the dog as mom instead of their real mom. And so then they're genetically programmed to follow whoever mom is. And so there's fascinating videos showing chicks who see moving toys and they become bonded, they become imprinted on the moving toy if it's present between 12 and 24 hours after they've hatched. So they follow that parent. Super interesting thing. So, and proximate and ultimate, I just want you to think, why is that happening? So physiologically, what's happening? So we got to be talking about some genetics there and some neurology. And ultimately, why is that happening? Why is that behavior a good idea? Well, it's a fabulous idea because it keeps those chicks safe. They recognize their mom and they stick with her and they never deviate from mom. And that allows them to get food and that keeps them safe. So it's a really great behavior most of the time. So this image here is super, I just love this story about whooping cranes and saving whooping cranes. They were an endangered species. They're doing better now because of efforts of scientists. In this first picture down in the bottom left, you see a scientist who's actually dressed in a ridiculous costume, but what matters is that they have a puppet head that has the red crown of the whooping crane adult. And that scientist is using that crane costume to feed the offspring so that they are not imprinting on a human being. They are imprinting on a crane and they think it's a crane and it works. And so they're not identifying just with the human, they're identifying with a crane. And then they take these silly crane costumes and they put them in ultralights. The pilots are wearing these crane costumes and then they teach the babies how to fly. They teach them their migration patterns and these scientists fly them from one migratory spot to the next and then back again so that they know how to do it. And they've had lots of amazing success. Super cool. And then the other thing I was going to mention, this is the father of really animal behavior studies, and Konrad Lorenz, and he has some super interesting videos of him having birds imprint on him, and he's swimming with the birds, and they're following all around him, and it's hilarious. I think he did most of his research like in the 1960s. I think that's about right. All right, I think I'm going to pause right here, you guys, and we'll start up another video just because this gets kind of long for everybody. So give me a moment here, and you can watch part 2 in just a moment.